Dominic Bryan at Queen's University. Can I depict the two papers? It seems to me that you could argue that you had two groups of people. You had a small cadre of women who achieved a heck of a lot, and a large cadre of men who died achieving almost nothing. All right? And I wonder, Margaret, particularly, what it says about our society that next year we will have lots and lots of men in uniforms marching around the streets and far fewer women remembering the changes that those events made for our society as regards women.
I think it shows how difficult it is for women to be part of the national narrative. There are so many events happening at the moment that women are not part of. So it's great when we do have events that give women space and give historians space to tell people of what women have done. But it's the same in terms of women's lack of representation in every walk of our society, then and now. You know, I think the suffragettes would have been appalled to think that they went to prison for the vote, and 100 years later, representation of women is so appalling, and the barriers are still so great.
Brian Hanratty. Just a question for the panel. Countess Markievicz was one of the first female government ministers, not just in Ireland, but globally, I think. To what extent do the panel believe that that appointment was influenced by the suffragette movement?
You mean her appointment as a cabinet minister later on? As a cabinet
minister, yeah.
Countess Markievicz was the second minister, because Alexander Kollontai in Russia was the first. When she became Labour minister, Kathleen Clark said to her, "How did you manage to convince the men?" Because Kathleen knew from her own experience of trying to be a candidate in the 1918 election, she said, "I knew the men were not over-eager to promote women into positions of influence." Markievicz said to her, "I told them I'd go over to Labour if they didn't appoint me." But it's interesting because I've actually just written a chapter for a book on her career as a Labour minister, because I find that historians, just say she was Labour minister, she was the first woman, but they don't look at what she actually achieved. Or one book that looks at the first Dáil says she achieved nothing, and then says about another minister, well, of course he wasn't able to achieve anything given the conditions that they worked under, and doesn't seem to see, what value judgments that are there. So it's very interesting seeing what she did try to achieve in terms of looking at wage levels, working conditions, at a time when the Dáil was underground. And I think needs a lot more credit for what she tried to do, because even when she was in jail, she was reading Labour books, trying to think herself into the role.
Jim, any thoughts?
I don't think I have anything much to add. I mean, I would simply say that the role of women in unionism before the war is quite an odd one, and that you have an awful lot of mobilisation through the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, but a lot of them are actually anti-suffrage, which seems very, very peculiar, and a lot of that then feeds through to the war work, that you get these nursing units that are formed, the UVF hospital, which of course is based in what's now the grounds of Queen's University, and so on, but that doesn't really contribute much to the suffrage movement on the face of it.
Countess Markievicz plays a key role on the propaganda front, speaking all over Ireland, for example, 1917, 1918, following her release. Even in places like Belfast and Downpatrick, you find her, Crossmaglen, very prominently involved there on that front, and so on. And I suppose she brought in someone from a different social class who had a very strong radical record as well.
Eamon Lavery, it's just on the last remark by Dr. Margaret Ward. Countess Markievicz, I mean, she, as we all know, she became a member of Westminster as well. But the question of she couldn't get very much done, and she basically disagreed with the women, with the men, in trying, when she became Minister of Labour. Does that not fly in the face of the promotion of women within the proclamation. I mean, when she was elected in the 1918 elections, I mean, she was the only woman, I think. Was it not a question of them thinking, well, that's the job done, basically we've got her in, you know, and after, when the new government of Ireland came in, there was actually very little promotion of women. So really, was that, as I said, did that fly in the face of everything that they had fought for? I mean, I'm aware of Arthur Griffiths' thing was women, you know, the nationalism comes first. Let's get it out of the way. And then the same thing could be said really for Labour. You know, Labour must wait.
I think there's a great conservatism within the First Dáil. You know, most of the Sinn Féin TDs were from professional or middle class backgrounds. For example, the democratic programme of the First Dáil, a very radical document, was more or less set aside quite quickly. It was a concession to that small Markievicz perhaps influenced socialist element in Sinn Féin and republicanism that was considered to be, we'll tick that box but will not actually act on it. And I think from 1922 right through certainly to the 60s, I can't remember any woman being elected as a cabinet minister in the Free State or in the subsequent republic. I can't think of anybody offhand. Maybe somebody can, but hers was a very exceptional appointment, and it wasn't a terribly safe seat. It had been a very strongly held Home Rule seat, which did include, you know, obviously St Stephen's Green, where she had been second in command during the Rising, and as she had said, you know, that she had not feared British bullets, something she kept saying at every platform as stones clattered off her break in Cool Island and across Glen after 1918.
Hello, I was just wondering if any of the panel had any unease on ethical or professional grounds in participating in government-funded centenary events like this. Let me explain what I mean. I think when I come to these events, there seems to be a determination to avoid anything that may offend anybody. And in doing so, there's a studious attempt to avoid the big issues, like why did 16 million people go to their deaths? And what many believe was needless, no less so than the last British soldier who died, who says it was slaughter, legalised mass slaughter. There just seems to be a complete reluctance to interrogate this. Because if we don't learn from history, as one very famous academic says, if we don't interrogate history and the pretexts given by governments, then we're condemned to repeat it. We're condemned to, what it does is set the basis for crimes that lie ahead. And I think personally we'll get much more robust debate in the pubs in Alneytown, the Shankill Road, than you do, to be honest, coming to events like this. Whereas there seems to be a very noble intent not to offend anybody, but in doing so, completely avoids the issues that are staring at people in the face.
Well, I think you're raising the issues right now. We have a very public attempt to engage with the issues. You know, at a previous meeting, I remember a speaker saying, everybody remembers the last man who fought in the First World War on the Shankill Road. He was, you know, Sammy so-and-so, such and such a street. Nobody remembers the last man on the Falls Road. I mean, people are raising issues about how we remember the past, about, you know, myths about the past. We're trying to explode those, but I don't think there's any attempt to subvert free speech on these matters, but maybe my co-speakers would like to respond as well.
Well, I go really wherever I'm asked to speak. I speak to a lot of small community-based groups that don't have funding. My passion is to talk about women's involvement and the difficulties that women face and the challenges they overcome, and try and get away from what I see as a very male-centred way of looking at history. So I feel that what I do does challenge. I don't see this as any kind of attempt to be nice to people, but to raise issues.
Yes, again, you know, as academics, we're told to get out of the ivory towers. You know, the other thing is I could just go back and teach all my students and never bother doing any sort of outreach events. So there's an attempt to try and lead to some sort of informed debate. Like you, I don't think that the death of 16 million men, if it was 16 million men and women that died in the First World War, was a good thing. But we have to understand the reasons for that, and that's hopefully something that we're doing a bit of today. In terms of the brief that we're given, we've been given no term that you have to make this all a cross-community love-in, and you'll have taken from some of my remarks and some of the myths that are created about the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster Division that I certainly wasn't banned into that and wasn't sort of pushed into that brief.
I think we're all in a position where we're invited to speak everywhere. I've spoken in Fermanagh, Tyrone, the Glens of Antrim, Cavan, Monaghan, sometimes isolated communities along the border, particularly on the southern side, who have been outside the Irish state for a century and are now beginning to engage and looking at issues which left them perhaps on the wrong side of the line. Or, for example, in West Belfast, which was 3-1 for Joe Devlin and Home Rule, rejecting De Valera in 1918. That's a fact we have to engage with. When we're looking at the history of that period, it's much more complex than people think. And I think we're engaging with those issues. And I've found a massive appetite right across this community and on a cross-community basis for these kind of events. I mean, I remember speaking 2 years ago on the Newton Ards Road, just at the end of the flag protests in sort of Templemore Avenue Community Centre, from the UVF man at the Rising to Patrick Pearse on the Newton Ards Road. And I was a bit worried going that evening. I said to my wife, I'm going to borrow your car if you don't mind, because things had been a bit hairy that summer. But the place was packed, and people listened to why Patrick Pearse had gone to a school on the Newton Ards Road, which was a bilingual school run by a relative of Owen MacNeil, and how the UVF man from their community ended up watching the GPO for a week and writing it all down. So I think we are engaging with communities, Can we have another question, please?
Hello, I would just like to ask, is it true that there was more women signed the Ulster Covenant than men, and would you view that as a sign of political activism?
Certainly more women signed the Declaration, which reflected their lower status as non-voters than I think 230,000 women as against 218,000 men, was it? So it reflected the fact they were non-voters. They had a separate declaration. In 1912. Maybe you want to say something, Tim?
I suppose you should say a fair number of men couldn't vote back in 1912 either, 1912, 1913. But I think a lot of that reflects the fact that the Ulster Women's Unionist Council was very well organised, and I think there is an issue where they're much better and more effective at canvassing than some of the male organisations are.
Irish Citizen, which was the paper of the suffrage movement in Ireland, it covered all groups. It had quite a correspondence about the Women's Declaration, because it wasn't on the same par as the men's, and they felt that it did show women having a second-class status.